Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you this afternoon. I have the privilege to speak about probably the most important management practice that most farmers have to do with. And it's a very difficult one to speak about in 30 minutes. So I could speak about the placement of an irrigation probe for 30 minutes, but I thought let's quickly have an overview of why we irrigate, when we irrigate, so how we measure when we should irrigate, and then finally, once we have this measurement, how do we decide to manage our irrigation according to what we're seeing in the field? So that'll be our structure for the talk. A picture says 1,000 words. So with adequate soil and planting a crop and the strategic placement of water, known as irrigation, water can create life in exciting environments. If you look at a Google Earth image of Saudi Arabia, you'll be shocked at how they abuse their aquifers, firstly. But surprisingly, over-irrigation is the biggest problem to their lack of production there, not under-irrigation. So water is life. There's 5 things I just want to look at quickly as to why we irrigate. There's lots more. I know we had some physiologically detailed talks earlier, but I'm going to go very superficial through 5 topics here. Firstly, photosynthesis uses water. Carbon dioxide comes into the tree through the stomata. We need water and light to create sugar and oxygen. As easy as that. And I'm very glad Dr. Schmeiser spoke about that earlier. Secondly, water is a brilliant solvent. Same as it works in a human as a solvent, it works in a tree. So elements or nutrients and hormones move up from the roots to the leaves, and also sugars and hormones will move from the leaves down to the roots in this water solvent. Thirdly, temperature regulation. The more obvious one is in the same way as when a person runs the Comrades Marathon, he tends to sweat just a little bit depending on how fit he is. When he sweats, the water evaporating off his skin will cool him down. So a tree will transpire, and the water that goes into the atmosphere will take some heat with it, and so cool the plant down, known as transpiration. Conversely, if we have a frost risk, like we do in many areas, I think the whole Argentinian industry is at a frost risk, we can use overhead irrigation. What it does is we're introducing heat to the system. So the water that you're sprinkling in the atmosphere will warm the air so that we don't have the tree freezing and getting that kind of damage. So we need to think a little bit broader than just putting water on the soil surface. The fourth one is Turgor pressure. Prof. Karen Tron also referred to Turgor earlier on. We can compare a plant cell to a balloon. When we blow into the balloon, the air will cause it to get bigger and bigger and build up Turgor pressure. So a cell that is full of water will be harder, and that'll cause the leaf to open up like this, look towards the sun, and intercept more light. That's a fully functional plant. When water is not adequately available, water will move out of the vacuole, it'll shrink, the leaf will go smaller and fold, and we see it as wilting. Now in the short term, it's a very good mechanism for the plant to protect itself, because now it doesn't have this massive surface area building up heat. It's making itself smaller so it doesn't get too hot. But that's a short-term solution for the plant, because if the tree wilts, it can no longer transpire, can't let CO2 in, so the long-term effect is no sugars, no growth, but we'll get there just now. And then fourthly is soil conditioning. Don just mentioned that issue that you get when you bring clay into the profile. When we have hard setting in even a sandy soil, or if we've got a fine blocky structure that at the correct soil moisture would be a really good soil form, allow that soil to dry out completely, a root won't go in there. With that, we also get hydrophobicity. If you allow to get your soil to dry out completely, you struggle to get the water in, especially these, what we call fatty soils that we have in the Western Cape, if you have a bleached topsoil. Preferential flow, the easiest way to illustrate that is you place water on the surface, and it goes in like a funnel, only down one channel into the soil. We don't have a uniform wetting medium throughout the profile. So if we keep the soil moisture adequate throughout the profile, we have less preferential flow and less hydrophobicity, which makes a fairly nice environment for a root to grow in. And then the last one there, we can avoid salinity. If you allow your soil to dry out too much while adding food, then you increase the salt status in your profile, and that's also not a very nice place for a root to grow. So you can flush your excess salts through the profile, or you can just dilute them through adequate irrigation. So we basically want to control the soil so that the plant conditions are optimal for crop production. Those are just 5 points that I thought were quite practical to keep in the back of your mind as we go on through the monitoring and the actual scheduling. Right. I broke my own rules by putting too much writing on one slide, but I thought some of you might want to take pictures this time of the afternoon, as the memory is not so ayoba anymore. If we run through this example here, firstly, too much water and too little water often has the same effect. The plant doesn't function properly. We're farming with water and oxygen, so you need to remember you need 10% oxygen in your profile. So let's say in this example we don't have enough water. Firstly, the plant recognizes it's getting a little bit dry down there, so it releases abscisic acid, which is the stress hormone produced in the roots. That's transported up to the leaves. The osmotic pressure drops, and the stomata will close. So the stomata are those little cells that Michael spoke about earlier that open up when there's enough water to let carbon dioxide in and water out. So these shut. The plant can no longer transpire, so the radiator is not working anymore, so the leaf temperature increases. The plant is able to kind of keep water to itself because it doesn't have a lot of water, so it's protecting the water, but it's also not letting CO2 in. No more photosynthesis occurs, so carbon dioxide assimilation, carbohydrate synthesis, and all kinds of metabolic processes slow down until the tree goes into shutdown. Now, certain crops, when they're stressed in the morning, they can wake up again by the afternoon. But other crops, like citrus for instance, stress a little bit in the morning, it struggles to wake up until the next morning. So what happens when you don't have metabolism or carbohydrate synthesis or CO2 assimilation happening properly? A reduction in cell division and cell growth. We spoke about it earlier about getting some extra fruit size. Having more cells and bigger cells gives us bigger fruit. So that directly affects your cell enlargement of your fruit, but also you'll have less new growth in that season or in that period. So even for young trees, too much, too little irrigation, you'll have retarded growth. So how do we measure? I think I've reached a new level of being a nerd because I'm quoting a mathematician in this slide, but every line is the perfect length if you don't measure it. I've often asked a farmer if he says, yes, but this orchard isn't producing so lekker. So I ask him, okay, how's your nutrition? We look at it, no, it's good. How did you thin? No, we thinned out in time. And I ask him, how's your irrigation? No, my irrigation's fine. Just don't go there. Because we're scared to learn, to see what are we doing wrong. It's not a matter of you're bad at this. It's a matter of let's improve where we can. Because no one thing will make the difference. It's a combination of all the topics we were covering today. So this slide ties in with what Don was speaking about earlier. We know we need to measure, but where do we measure? We've got so much variation. We need to make sure that the place that we are measuring is representative of a large enough area so that when we respond to that measurement, it actually makes an impact. So this example here, we've got a section where there's a clay portion and then a sandy portion, and on the NDVI, the clay section, there's more vigor. So we need to kind of treat those areas differently, but we're looking at soil depth, water holding capacity, infiltration, slope, texture. There's a lot of variation. So we need to understand these factors within each orchard. This is an analysis done at the lab where we take a soil sample in an orchard. This is 2 soil samples in an orchard, and we analyze for the water holding capacity of the soil. Now, the traditional track of thought goes, sand holds the least water, and then we go to the loam, and then clay holds the most. So why do we find that the sandy loam soil here has half the water holding capacity than the sandy soil? It doesn't make any sense. So let's go look here. 11% clay, 3% clay. We need to look at the specific grading of that soil texture. So here we find that we have 77% fine sand and 35% fine sand here. So the grading, which is the number of particles you have from each size class, is much better here. So there's a little bit of everything. But if we look here, that's poorly graded. That would be sample B. We've got a lot more macropores. And in this scenario, that had a higher water holding capacity. It's not always the case. That's why it's necessary to go and look and just see what you are working with. So understand your specific risk and your specific variation within your orchard. Once you know what is the largest area that's uniform and significant, go monitor that area. So how do we measure? I'm going to look at 5 methods to measure. There are more, but I like these 5. So first one is to compare crop factors. Secondly, field observations, or what we like to call the human probe. Half-X, 2X lines, fruit look, and then capacitance probes. So I'm going to touch on every single one just so you know what it actually means. And then right at the end, there's a very nice summary slide that I see some of you are clicking away. Just take a picture of that last slide. I'll tell you when it's there. Okay, so the first one is comparing crop factors. Not a very accurate, not a very detailed method, but it gives you a very good idea if you are irrigating correctly in a specific period, like say in a specific month. So we've got the, let me laser this time on this side. So we've got 3 crop factors that we're looking at. So firstly, we've got the actual crop factor. That's the amount of water applied in the specific orchard, divided by the amount of water that evaporated out of the orchard. Then we've got our industry crop factor, which is pretty standard for a given area and a specific crop. So that's very, very rigid. And recently we also have the fruit look crop factors. Please note that these are example values and curves here. They tend to vary a lot more. But what we'll be able to see is, are we following a correct trend? Very often we find that early in the season here, our crop factors are quite low, but we've got a spike in irrigation. It's a kind of an indication that you're irrigating too much too early in the season. So that's one method. Second method, Don, I stole your picture. The second method is the human probe. Just print out a piece of paper with all your orchard numbers, topsoil, subsoil, and then rate the soil a 1 to 5. 5 being too wet, 1 being too dry, 3 being just right. I think this is probably the most commonly used method in our industry at the moment, but it does require quite a bit of calibration because eventually the guys doing the tests realize that you want them to say a 3, and then they just start saying 3, 3, 3, as opposed to what it actually is. The next one is the half-X, 2X lines. A brilliant method as we are actually measuring the fruit, because we're farming with fruit, we're not farming with soil or roots or anything else. We want to export fruit. So what we're doing here is we are comparing the weekly fruit growth of 3 different irrigation regimes. So in an orchard, you go and adjust one irrigation line to only give half the amount of water that you're giving that orchard. Then you've got your X line, which is the normal irrigation, and then your 2X line, which is now giving twice the amount of water you're giving the rest of the orchard. Then we go and measure approximately 100 fruit on every tree, on every row, and we'll be able to see, well, which row had the most fruit growth in that week. So let's look at 4 scenarios. Firstly, the middle graph that shows the X line. This is good irrigation because our X line gave us the most growth. Then we've got a scenario here where our 2X line gave the most growth. That means we under-irrigated. We could have gotten more fruit growth in that week. And then here we've got a scenario where the half-X line gave us the most growth, which means we over-irrigated. Every now and then we get these ram horns here. That's bad measurements. You can't have half the amount of water and twice the amount of water giving you the most growth. So that's poor measurements, and that is a big limitation of this method because the guy measuring the fruit gets bored. or he measures the wrong fruit, or the fruit fall off and you eventually don't have enough fruit to measure, but each method has its limitations. But this is a retrospective method. You're only getting these measurements a week or two after you've done that irrigation. So it's a very difficult one to look at, but very useful. The next one is Fruit Look. I think Fruit Look's been mentioned here every year for the last 3 years. This is a very nice example on table grapes. We pulled the data off Fruit Look, and we put it into our own models just to kind of display it all on one sheet. So the top line, this is our biomass accumulation or biomass production. The one in the middle, this is our vegetative index. And this one at the bottom here, this is our evaporation deficit. Evaporation deficit meaning the higher the value, it means you've got a lot of water missing in your profile. You need to add water, so it's the deficit. If we look here, in the rapid cell enlargement phase, we had evaporation deficit for 3 weeks. It's the 3 weeks leading up to Christmas. Does that sound familiar? If we compare that to the vegetative index, we see a downward curve here. If you look at the biomass production, we have a downward curve here. This orchard lost a lot of money because there was poor irrigation in this phase here. So at the end of the season, they're thinking, yes, but was it my nutrition? Was it this? Was it that? I think irrigation definitely contributed to this problem. So it's very nice for us to just see the whole season on one sheet. And then the last one is capacitance probes. Also growing in popularity. Many farms use these. I personally love them. We can see the soil moisture in real time at 6 different depths throughout the profile. We can see the extraction, we can see water wastage. There's quite a few service providers for this, and it's growing every year. I mean, so many people just send an email, even from China, and like, you can't even read the email, but they're saying, we make probes, please buy them. So there's a lot of hardware out there, but look at the software as well. You can buy your Samsung Galaxy at MTN or Vodacom. You're going to go where you're going to get the best service, or actually you're going to go where you can get the least bad service. Personal vendetta, sorry. All right, this is the one you must take the photo of if you want to take a picture of this one. Just to compare the 5 methods, cost implication, probes are expensive, but you buy them, you have them, you use them. Probes are expensive. The Fruit Look for now is still free, which is wonderful, so please start using it to see if it's for you before it becomes expensive. Otherwise, you're going to have to pay money to try it out. Half X, 2X lines, people need to go measure the fruit, and you actually want to take someone that knows how to do it properly. So that's a labor implication. And the field observations, the human probe, you'll need a team of guys to go measure the soil moisture. But the last 2 methods, you've actually got feet moving around in the orchard, which has massive implication for, that's the micro jet next to the probe has fallen over. You wouldn't have picked that up if you didn't have the guy walking there. You can see there's runoff. So having people moving through the orchard, you're picking up a lot more than any of the electronic devices can that we use. Retrospect, looking back at last week's irrigation, that's Fruit Look, Half X, 2X, and the crop factors. I mean, it's great saying, last week we irrigated well. What do we need to do now? That's where capacitance probes and the field observations are great. Field observation is what does it look like now? The probes, what does it look like now? What did it look like an hour ago? Let's irrigate and see what it looks like then. So that's really good. Okay, so we've got a couple of methods to monitor our irrigation. You ask me which one is the best. Use all 5 of them. Why not? 3 of them says you've over-irrigated, 1 says you've under-irrigated, and the 1 says you've done okay. The majority said you over-irrigated, so listen to that. If you only have 1 method and something went wrong, if you've only got a probe and the battery dies and you didn't go feel, you don't know what's going on. So use a couple of methods. Eventually you'll say, well, I really trust my probe and I really trust my guy doing the observations with his hands. So I'm going to use those 2 methods, and you kind of leave the other 3. But try them out. So how do we integrate this knowledge or this information to make a decision whether we should irrigate more or less or stop irrigating altogether? Here I'm going to look at 3 things. The crop phonology, the theoretical schedule, absolutely theoretical. I know you guys love theory. And then we're going to take that into practice. Always, 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 always start with crop phonology. What is happening in the plant right now that I need to be aware of so that I can manage it? This is very, very general, so obviously there's quite a few phonological stages that overlap. But say, for instance, we are early in the season, the water demand is fairly low. So here we can allow a little bit more extraction because your risk factor is lower. Then we move from there to cell division. Once again, the water demand isn't massive, but the soils are starting to dry out, so I need to start irrigating. So instead of allowing 50% extraction, I allow 45% extraction. Then we're moving into fruit growth. Here you don't want to be making a mistake. You don't want to, like this year, for instance, this season in December, we had that ridiculously hot week in December, or that 2 weeks in December. That's during rapid cell enlargement, and you need to know that's happening. So you need to understand how serious it is that you need to irrigate correctly. You don't have time to quickly take your bucky for a service. You need to irrigate now. So here, our risk is high. So we're only going to allow 35% extraction so that we've got a buffer of 15% in case the main line breaks. I don't have 2 days or 3 days to fix it if I allow 50% extraction. So understand your risk according to the phonology. Okay, here you guys can take out your calculators as well if you like, but there's some theory. Once again, there's a lot of formulas here, but the next slide there's a formula with an example, so if you want to take a photo of that just to go and try it out on all your orchards back on the farm, you're more than welcome to. What we need to know for the theoretical schedule is firstly, what is your reservoir size? How much water can your root zone hold? And for that we need to know what kind of sponge are we working with? Is it a clay, sand, loam? What's the water holding capacity? I showed you the analysis earlier. We can analyze the water holding capacity. It's not expensive and it doesn't change. What's your root depth? I don't know. Go look. Dig a pit, look at your roots. If 80 or 90% of your roots are on the top 50 centimeters, then use 50 centimeters and then add a 10 or 20 centimeter buffer that you'll tend to every now and then when it dries out. Look at your wetted width. For young orchards, when the roots haven't grown so wide, you can go look at the root width and make it a bit narrower, but generally we use the wetted width from the micro as our root width because you can't manage outside of that. And then you look at your row width because you need to bring it down from full surface area to just on the tree row. The percentage extraction mentioned there, that is according to the risk factor. Remember we said that during cell enlargement, we don't want to take a lot of risks, so you're only going to allow 35% extraction. So you need to know that's how much water you need to hold the whole time. Times it by 10, that's to convert the millimeters to cubes. Okay, always go to cubes per hectare because then you can, that's the equivalent of tons per hectare. Then you can kind of do your comparisons. The next one is the depletion rate. How quickly is that bucket going to empty? And that's going to depend on your evaporation. And you can get that from your weather stations, and you need your crop factors. I spoke earlier about those industry crop factors. I'm sure HORTGRO has them on their website. If they don't, I'm putting pressure on you guys. No, sorry. And then irrigation frequency is how often will I have to irrigate theoretically. That is, the amount of water I hold divided by how quickly the water is depleted. Quickly run through an example there. I've got a water holding capacity of 91 millimeters per meter, root depth 50 centimeters or 0.5 meters. I've got a 4 meter row spacing, 2 meter width. Say it's in a critical period, so 35% extraction times 10. My soil can hold 80 cubes of water on a hectare. That is my bucket. That's how big my bucket is. And it is depleted at 20 cubes per hectare per day if I've got 2.9 mil pan evaporation or evapotranspiration and working with a crop factor of 0.7. Now those of you who've done it knows I've jippered this data a little bit to make it easy values because that millimeter and that crop factor don't quite match up. Okay, poetic license. And then lastly, our irrigation frequency, we can hold 80 cubes, 20 cubes is being used every day, so every 4 days I will have to fill up my whole profile. Awesomely theoretical. So how long is it going to take me to fill up my reservoir? You take the number of micros, or the number of emitters you have per hectare, times it by the amount of water that every emitter applies. Times it by the system efficiency. Now, don't go overestimate your system efficiency. Don't say you've got a micro system that's running at 99% efficient. Water gets blown away, water evaporates, your pressure's not right, you've got a crust forming, so water runs off your ridge. This is all water loss that's not ending up in your reservoir. And then divided by 1,000 to go from liters to cubes. So once again, we're working in cubes per hectare per hour. And your irrigation runtime is how big is your reservoir divided by how much water do I add per hour. So if we plug theoretical values in there, we say I've got 1,667 micros, and every micro will give 30 liters in an hour. My system efficiency is poor because it's an old system. That's at 80%. That gives me 40 cubes per hectare per hour. And earlier we saw that my soil can hold 80 cubes. So I need to irrigate for 2 hours to fill my reservoir. There we go. In theory, those are your yellow lines if you're driving. It's okay to move in between them if there's not a car coming from the other side, but you can move between those yellow lines. This is your guideline. If you've never irrigated on a farm before, this is safe. Even if it's wrong, you can take it to your boss and say, listen, I kind of did it by the book. Just give me some slack. Okay, so we need to apply 2 hours of water every 4 days. But this is only theoretical and it's not practical. So 2 things we pick up when we follow this irrigation schedule is, if I apply 2 hours of water, I waste a lot of water. That spike there indicates that we're wasting water. We've set our full line at the top there. We can spend a whole day talking about this as well, and I'll do that if the chair allows me afterwards. So we're wasting water here. So 2 hours is too much. And then we also see that if I wait 4 days, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, I'm under my cultivar line for the specific phenological stage. So waiting 4 days is also a little bit long. So that theoretical schedule isn't correct. So what do? Okay, I don't give 2 hours anymore, so I don't give 80 cubes. Let's decrease it to 60 cubes. And instead of giving all of it every 4 days, I'm going to give half of it every 2 days. So now I'm going to give 45 minutes of water every 2 days instead of 2 hours every 4 days. So you've calculated what you need to do, you did it, you went and you looked what happened, and you corrected it so you can do it better next time. That's a very good structure you've got there. So in summary, water is very important, duh. Use a combination of monitoring techniques that suits your farm, that suits your capacity. Some farms have a person for every 20 hectares to go do human probe observations. Other farms don't. So maybe invest in some more probes for that farm. Some farms have uniform soil types, so you can have 5 probes. Other farms have 10 million soil types. Give them more probes. So it's very specific to your farm. And then you need to know the theory of your system. So what is your system designed on? Hopefully the guy did a soil survey and he's got irrigation breaks according to the soil variation. So you need to know what's the reservoir per irrigation break. And for that you need your root depth and your wetted width. What's the depletion rate? And then how long is it going to take me to fill that root zone again? And then I need to apply water. I need to monitor what happened when I applied that water. And then I need to adjust my practice so I can do it better tomorrow. That's it. Thank you very much.